Hi, baby. Baby, you have to listen to me carefully. I'm on a plane that's been hijacked. I'm on the plane. I'm calling from the plane. I want to tell you I love you. Please tell my children that I love them very much. And I'm so sorry, babe. I hope to be able to see your face again, baby. I love you. Bye.
Reports are just coming in of an explosion at Liverpool Street Station here in London.
I'm at Aldgate. I can confirm a bomb damage to train, one carriage completely wiped out, at least 9 people very seriously injured and trapped, 2 confirmed fatalities.
All of a sudden there was this explosion, big white appeared, and then it was just smoke everywhere. In the tunnel, we was trying to close the doors because it was just smoke, we couldn't breathe.
On July 7, 2005, at the end of the morning rush hour, 3 near-simultaneous explosions tore apart the London Underground. Within an hour, the entire subway network was evacuated, and a 4th explosion in a bus underscored that this was a terrorist operation. The bombings shattered the British counter-terrorism service's assumptions about the global neo-jihadi threat to Britain. Authorities pondered whether Al-Qaeda was a loose coalition with no clear leadership or a highly structured group with international reach that posed a clear threat to the United Kingdom. These two perspectives are not just academic disputes, but raise important issues with real consequences in terms of counterterrorism strategy. What sorts of distinct measures are needed to combat these opposing forms of terrorism? What can we learn from the ways in which the London terror attacks were planned and executed, and from Britain's response? The British police said that a team of 4 British-born men had carried out deadly terrorist attacks in London, including at least one possible suicide bombing, which would be the first in Britain. The police said that the body of one of the men had been found in the wreckage of the London Underground, and that property belonging to the other 3 was found at the location of the other blasts. The police stopped short of declaring that the attacks were suicide bombings. The breakthrough came as the police searched 6 houses in the northern city of Leeds, and found explosives in one home, and in an abandoned car, parked at the train station in Luton, just north of London. The police also arrested one man in West Yorkshire, whom they did not identify. In Leeds, residents said several young men, whose families initially moved to Britain from Pakistan, had travelled to London late last week, and had not been seen since. But far from being London's 9/11s, Britain remembers its terror attack rather differently to the US. While the US spent many years after 2001 contemplating its place in the world, and indeed seeking to export its idea of democracy to other countries, the British were forced to look inward at their own culture. The government of the time was heavily involved in the same war on terror as the US, but this was a homegrown attack that required a homegrown response. The 2001 terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in New York, and the Pentagon near Washington, D.C., seemed to come out of nowhere. The attack struck central symbols of US global power, and cut deep into the American psyche. Many suddenly felt unsafe in their own country. The events raised fundamental questions about what it means to be an American citizen, and in some ways brought the country together after the deep divisions of the Vietnam War. There was a moment of pause. People reflected upon how the US, which was supposed to bring good into the world, could be hated so much that it could be so violently attacked. The vigils and reflection were soon put aside. President George W. Bush, driven by heroic masculinity, was to seek revenge in Afghanistan and Iraq. You were with the US or against it?
It wasn't a regular commute at all. London was a place I didn't go to very much. I was also slightly thrown by the fact that, not knowing London that well, that the stations were absolutely rammed with people still at 8:30 in the morning. I would assumed they'd all got to work by then. So it went from that sort of overground part into the darkness of the tube. Within, I should think, less than a minute, there was an enormous sound. It was a sound that you both heard and felt, with an immediate blackness following. And I think for some of us with a bit of eyesight challenge, total darkness is something we fear a great deal. The sound element is also almost impossible to describe. It's beyond dropping a book on a floor. It has a really, really loud noise that enters into your head. It physically hurts in your ears.
By 2005, many felt it was only a matter of time before London was hit. After Bali and Madrid and, indeed, New York, London seemed an obvious target, particularly given Britain's involvement in the Iraq War. This was not an attack that came out of nowhere. It was already several years into the war on terror, and people were already concerned about whether the motives for invading Iraq and Afghanistan were just. This was also a city already accustomed to the threat of terrorist attack. The IRA bombing campaigns of the 1980s and 90s had shaped London life to a certain extent. But what was long-lasting was the realization that the young men who had taken so many lives on 7/7s had been brought up in Britain. 3 of the 4 attackers were British-born, and the 4th an early migrant. Because it was young British men who took so many lives in London that day, there are complex feelings about what it is to be British. But where the Americans thought about their own national identity on the global stage, the UK was interrogating relations at home. Young nationals were identifying more with sufferings in foreign lands than with their fellow citizens, and no one appeared to have noticed. More young men have been lost to the idealism of radical groups abroad. They are fighting in Syria and Iraq, but the same questions are being asked back home. When British values are invoked, they need to be values that can be shared by young British Muslims. We need to remember 7/7s as a warning of what can happen when young men feel bereft of a sense of belonging.